Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in your beautiful city and to be here with scientists that push the envelope, as the people here do. They take lots of chances when you do that sort of thing, to buck the traditionalists and to explore the unknown, as it were. We're going to talk about the unconscious today and all of the, not all of the, but some of the techniques that have been used to explore it, to probe for it, to get material out of it, and to put material into it. Some people wonder what priming is. Priming is sort of the new word for subliminal perception. It's not exactly the same, but it's close. Priming is the below-threshold presentation of stimuli in order to influence ongoing thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. There's an old Gnostic Gospel saying, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. That's not totally true, but there's a lot of enough truth in it to keep us working on this particular problem of bringing out what is within and changing it, perhaps, making it better. Why prime the unconscious? Because it is the seat of the most emotional mediation, especially the negative emotions. Its fear-conditioned memory stores affect many aspects of our daily lives, leading to pervasive feelings of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem in many of us. However, as one experiences negative, painful physical and mental situations throughout life, the unconscious and conscious parts of the mind develop psychological defense mechanisms, or DMs, to guard against these situations harming us again. How can we change this? If we assume that the brain operates something like a computer with memory storage, can we not find the troublesome negative memory locations and then replace what's in them, I should say, with positive memories? And that's what we call rescripting. The problem: the system of DMs guards against a conscious rescripting in most cases. This is why most affirmations don't work very well. You've all tried them. All of us have. They often don't work. They bounce off. There are some people for whom affirmations always work. And these are people who have never had very few, emotional or physical trauma in their life. And so they have not had to develop defense mechanisms to any great extent. And so affirmations do work for that select group of people, lucky people. They are designed to help the individual avoid the painful stimuli that traumatized them earlier. And Freud was instrumental in defining these psychological mechanisms. These DMs, unfortunately, also limit our truly experiencing a number of positive, pleasurable aspects of life. If you were bitten by a black dog when you were 4 years old, and you were traumatized by that, for the rest of your life, you may be afraid of black dogs and avoid them. In fact, you may avoid all dogs, and thus you lose the pleasure of having dogs as a pet. That's how defense mechanisms can work against you. This is a partial list of defense mechanisms: denial, suppression, repression, projection, displacement, reversal. Now, of all of those, reversal is the worst. Because what it does is, if you're told something, or if you're given an affirmation, and it hits that reversal defense mechanism, guess what happens? You do just the opposite. And so it's, for example, if you have a person who's overweight and you tell them, give them suggestions for losing weight, and they have a reversal defense mechanism, they will probably go out and eat more, and that's what they do. It's a very dangerous defense mechanism. Do they obscure self-awareness? Nietzsche said the axiom, each man is farthest from himself, will hold for us for all eternity. Of ourselves we are not knowers. We don't know the dark side very well. Brain lateralization, well, that's a mouthful, even for somebody who speaks English. Split brain studies of Roger Sperry and others in the 60s revealed the functions of the right or non-dominant hemisphere. David Gallen, in 1974, in a wonderful article in the Archives of General Psychiatry, brought all the split brain discoveries to bear on Freud's model of the unconscious. He found that the functions of the right brain did appear to be a good fit with Freud's model. So the right brain is more or less tied in with unconscious process. And interestingly enough, in case I don't remember to tell you later, the right hippocampus of the brain processes priming or subliminal stimuli, but the left one does not. Interesting, isn't it? How degraded stimuli, not in a moral sense, but degraded stimuli are processed in the right side of the brain. Left brain dominance. Since the invention of complex spoken language and the advent and eventual dominance of linguistic consciousness, many functions mediated by the right half of the cerebrum and the limbic system have often been viewed as dangerous, sinful, or irrelevant. Indeed, so autocratic and presumptuous is the left half of the brain that not only does it try not to be conscious of these natural abilities, impulses, and inclinations, but it often attempts to suppress or discard them as useless and unimportant. So is the right side the unconscious? Neuroscientists who specialize in the study of the brain have argued that the so-called unconscious mind is in fact a manifestation of right brain and limbic system mental activity. Conversely, what we regard as the conscious mind appears to be localized within and to be maintained and supported via the functional integrity of the left brain. Jane's faces. How many of you have heard of Jane's faces? That's good. I'm going to show you a slide next, and I want you to look at, there are two faces on the slide, one on the left and one on the right. I want you to look at the nose of each face very quickly and decide which face is the happiest. And then I'll ask you to raise your hands as to how many thought the left one was or the right one was. So we're going to do it very fast, so just take a quick look at each one and make a decision as to which face is the happiest face. How many thought the left face was the happiest one? Very few. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe. And the rest of you thought the other one was happiest? Yes. Of those that thought the left side was happiest, are you left-handed or do you have any left-handed relatives? Now that's very interesting. Let's go back to the faces. They're mirror images. But when you look at somebody's face, the left side of the face goes into your right brain, and vice versa. And most of us process facial expression in the right hemisphere of the brain. So we see the face on the right as the happier face. If you process emotion in your left brain, facial expression of emotion, then you'll see the left face as the happier face. Now, what kind of people do that? People who are left-handed, people who have left-handed mothers, fathers, grandparents, or, sad to say, people with brain damage. No, I'm just kidding. When I gave a talk, though, at Craig Rehab Hospital, which is the big hospital in Denver, where a lot of brain-injured people go, even those with very fancy names. Christopher Reeves was there. I gave a talk there, and I showed this set of faces, and all the people in back row, the last two rows, raised their hands and saw the left face as the happier face. I thought that was relatively strange, and so afterwards I asked the nurses, I was cleaning up my slides and everything, I said, well, what, it was a strange grouping of people. Usually there's a scattering in the audience of those who see the left face as happier. I said, but it was all in the back. And she laughed and she said, oh, those are our patients. So when you're brain damaged, your brain switches often and starts processing emotion on the other side. So that could be why. But there are other reasons too, so don't feel bad if you don't have left-handed relatives and you saw that left one as the happier one. The general approach that I'm talking about today is to develop a model of the mind that illustrates consciousness and unconscious processing, to discuss the characteristics of the defense mechanisms that guard against certain kinds of change, even positive, and examine procedures that can bypass these defense mechanisms and effect positive change. Go all the way back to Pierre Jeunet, who was one of the first people to do rescripting, actually. And he said there are crowds of things which operate within ourselves without our will. But simply bringing these things into consciousness was not enough. That's what Freud was doing. Jeunet found that under hypnosis, he could transform the trauma memory into a more positive story. We now call this rescripting. An example was a patient I had who had what I call the stinging arm. Her arm felt like it had been stung by bees. It had generalized to the other arm. Her husband had taken her to many medical centers, some of the most famous in the United States, and nothing could help her. She finally sought out biofeedback, and we tried that, and that didn't help. So under hypnosis, I found out that 3 years ago she had fallen off a horse, landed right on her face, suffered minimal brain damage, as they called it in those days, and some facial damage. She had to have plastic surgery. She was unconscious or semi-conscious in the hospital for 3 weeks. And guess what happened during that time? Some friends were visiting, and one of them was watching carefully as a nurse was putting an IV in the patient's arm. And she said, gee, that looks like it stings. And that was the statement that stuck in that person's brain because she was semi-conscious and her left brain was not there to defend against it and say, oh no, that's just temporary, which is what the left brain would know. Instead, it just stuck as a command for years afterwards. So what we did was rescripted it. We brought in a doctor, Marcus Welby, who was at that time a very famous guy playing a physician on television, and brought in this older man with a stethoscope and a white coat, and he stood there watching the procedure. The relative said, gee, it looks like it stings, but this Marcus Welby doctor said, oh, sure, just for a few seconds, and then it's perfectly all right. The arm feels good. And so when she was brought out of hypnosis, the sting was gone for the first time in 3 years. We never got a word of thanks from her husband, physician, though, which I thought was quite interesting. Anyway, hypnosis can be used for rescripting. Why? Because it can get at the unconscious and the unconscious content of what's bothering us. Not always, but often enough to warrant its use. So how do we bypass the DMs? A long time ago, back in the 70s, I did an extensive survey of all of the ways healers have used to help people. Many, if not most, involve using procedures that bypass the DMs and impart the healing stimulus to the unconscious mind. The next slide is from an article in August 1977, Psychology Today. and shows a diagram that illustrates this phenomena. And this is the diagram. Now, the three dash lines actually, there's one for the left brain, which is the smaller one, kind of toward the middle, and then one for the right, and then one for the total cortical system. It indicates activation levels in the two hemispheres. The left brain is capable of doing its exquisite job of analyzing information as it comes in symbolic form and so on. But because it has a more exquisite and difficult job to do than the right, it is sensitive to arousal level. Too high in arousal, it can't work, can't do its thing. Too low, and it can't do its thing either. If it's too sleepy or drowsy or not very logical or analytical, if you're too high, if your arousal level is too high, you can't do it either. If you get too nervous for a test, for example, your mind can go blank and blow the test. However, the right hemisphere has a wider arousal level over which it can operate. Why is that? It's because it's a more primitive brain form. And during the war, the British people, researchers investigating the guys that had to stare at those tracking screens to look for enemy aircraft, they found that the right brain could track longer than the left. As they were starting to get sleepy, the left brain would conk out. And somehow they had a way of testing as to which hemisphere it was. And the right brain did a better job in the long run. There are other things that enable people to either get over or under that left brain dominance range. Revival meetings, primitive ceremonies, extreme danger push you up over the top in terms of high arousal, so that the change message, if it were given, could come in to the right brain, which is still active. On the other hand, if you went down too low and you got people under hypnosis or twilight learning, which we'll explain later, or reverie or sleep learning, or sensory isolation, again, the left brain is kind of knocked out, and along with it go a lot of defense mechanisms, and then you can impart a change message which will take hold. So that's what this procedure is all about, or this graph. But look in the middle. There's some procedures that can operate with a totally intact two hemispheres, both operative. Certain kinds of hypnosis, like Milton Erickson's embedded suggestions. You're sitting there and you can relax. Well, you accept the idea that you are sitting there, and then the second part of the statement is connected with an and you can relax. So if you accept the first part, you usually accept the second part, even without thinking about it. So it's an example of an Ericksonian hypnotic suggestion. You can use it for every patient that comes in your office. You're sitting there now and you can relax. And most people will accept that and relax. There are lots of other examples, but we don't have too much time. Highly authoritarian commands. If the Pope were at a cocktail party with you and you were Catholic, and he said, 3 plus 4 is not 7. You'd probably nod and say, yes, Pope, you're probably right, just because he's a terribly big authority figure. So sometimes that can happen. Random numbers procedure, what the devil is that? Well, we'll explain that a little bit later in the context of dichotic listening. The Kung tribe. Harvard went out and investigated these guys for 5 or 6 years. They sent a team out there because the Kung were known to heal people. Not of broken bones and things like that, but a lot of disease process, including a lot of respiratory problems that are very difficult for even modern medicine to work with. And so they watched these guys. 90% of the male members of the Kung tribe become healers, and nearby tribes bring their sick to the Kung for healing. Now, a team from Harvard studied these amazing people for several years, and many primitive peoples heal the sick with strange to us ceremonies. The way the Kung do it, they would dance the people all night long if they could stand it, or until they dropped. These were the patients. And if you're debilitated with an illness, you don't last too long before you fall down. And then the witch doctors came over and tossed powder at them and different things, and said prayers and stuff, and the people would be healed. Now, why would they be healed? because they got them into their right hemispheres. They got the defense mechanisms out of the way.